stand in the middle of this island, and here's what you notice first. The quiet. No traffic beyond one battered ring road. No birdsong to speak of. Just wind, moving through what looks, and this isn't an exaggeration, almost exactly like the surface of the moon. Gray limestone spikes, some taller than a grown man, stretching out in every direction until they hit a thin green fringe of coconut palms at the coast. Locals call this stretch of land topside. It used to be the middle of the country. Now it's basically nowhere. This is Nauru, 21 square kilometers of coral rock sitting alone in the middle of the Pacific. And in 1975, if you happened to be born here, you were, on paper at least, one of the 2 richest people alive on the planet, measured per head. Not close to it either. Second place, right behind Saudi Arabia. Today, the same country runs largely on rent money for holding other people's problems, and nearly everyone living here is fighting some version of diabetes. So somewhere between 1975 and right now, something went catastrophically wrong. And the story of exactly what happened is one of the wildest, most avoidable economic collapses of the last. So stick around, because by the end of this, you'll never think about striking it rich quite the same way again. If you're new here, this is Geography Uncovered, and we dig into stories exactly like this one every week. So hit subscribe before you go, because trust me, it only gets stranger from here.
Okay, so to understand how a country ends up like this, you have to go back a lot further than the 1970s. Nauru was first spotted by Europeans in 1798, when a British whaling ship called the Hunter drifted past. Its captain, a man named John Fern, liked what he saw enough to name the place Pleasant Island. 12 local clans, coconut palms, a lagoon full of fish. Genuinely pleasant, by most accounts. Germany annexed it in 1888, mostly as an afterthought to a much bigger land grab across the Pacific. And for a while, nobody, not the Germans, not the traders passing through, had any real idea what was sitting underneath the surface. Here's where it gets almost absurd. In 1896, a cargo officer aboard a trading ship called the Lady M picked up an odd, heavy rock while stopped at Nauru. Thought it might make a nice souvenir. Maybe petrified wood, he guessed. He hauled it back to his employer's office in Sydney, where, because nobody knew what else to do with it, it became a doorstop. For 3 years. People walked past this thing every single day and thought nothing of it. Then, in 1899, a company analyst named Albert Ellis got transferred into that same Sydney office. Something about the rock nagged at him. He'd spent years testing phosphate samples from across the Pacific, and this one looked off. Too dense. Too heavy for its size. So he finally ran the test everyone else had skipped for 3 years. 78% pure phosphate. Some of the richest ore anyone had ever recorded. Phosphate is basically the backbone of modern fertilizer, and by 1900, industrial farming across Australia and New Zealand was desperate for it. Ellis sailed out to confirm the find in person, and mining kicked off in 1906 under a deal struck with Nauru's German administrators. The islanders themselves barely factored into the negotiation. Classic colonial arithmetic. Whoever showed up holding a contract got the resource, and whoever had actually lived there for 3,000 years got a fraction of the royalties, if that. Ownership changed hands violently over the decades that followed. Australian troops seized the island during the First World War. The League of Nations handed joint control to Britain, Australia, and New Zealand in 1919. Then, in 1942, Japan invaded. What followed was brutal. Forced labor, executions, and in 1943, roughly 1,200 Nauruans, nearly the entire population, were shipped off to a remote island called Truk to work as slave labor building military installations. almost 4 in 10 never made it home. The survivors didn't return until January of 1946, which means this is a country
that within living memory was nearly wiped off the map entirely. And then, within about 30 years of getting its people back, it became one of the richest places on Earth. Let that whiplash sink in for a second.
Independence came in 1968. 2 years later, Naurans took full control of the phosphate operation itself. No more foreign administrators skimming royalties off the top. Then the 1970s happened, and phosphate prices went through the roof. By 1975, Nauru's GDP per capita had hit somewhere around $50,000. Adjust for inflation, and you're deep into 6 figures in today's money. The New York Times, a few years later, ran a piece calling it the world's richest little isle. And it wasn't wrong. Naurans paid no income tax. Healthcare was free. Education was free. Housing was heavily subsidized. Government checks landed regularly enough that plenty of people simply didn't work. Why would you? The Rock was doing the working for you. Now, imagine you're the finance minister of this tiny 12-clan island nation in, say, 1972. Money is arriving faster than your government has any real infrastructure to spend it wisely. What do you actually do with it? Nobody fully knew. But to their credit, somebody in government did ask the harder question. What happens after the phosphate runs out? Because it would run out. Nauru is 8 square miles. There's a hard physical ceiling on how much rock you can pull from the ground before there's simply none left. So they built the Nauru Phosphate Royalties Trust, essentially a sovereign wealth fund, decades before that term was common vocabulary. Take the windfall now, invest it responsibly, let the returns support the country long
after mining stops. On paper, genuinely smart. Norway would later run a version of this exact playbook and end up with one of the most successful funds on the planet. Nauru did not end up like Norway. The trust ballooned past $1 billion at its peak. Real estate went up all over the world with that money. Office towers in Melbourne, a hotel in Hawaii, a building in Washington, D.C., a property on a quiet street in London. One Melbourne skyscraper, called Nauru House, got nicknamed the jewel in the crown of the whole portfolio. Then the money started leaving. Fast. A financial advisor talked the government into sinking cash into something called prime banknotes, a financial instrument that, despite the official sounding name, barely existed. Something like $60 million. Gone. Chasing a product that was never really real. And then, I promise this part isn't a joke, in 1993, the trust financed a West End musical about the life of Leonardo da Vinci. It was called Leonardo the Musical, A Portrait of Love. Nobody quite agrees on exactly what it cost.
The trust, somewhere between £2 million and roughly $5 million, depending which account you read. And honestly, at this point, does the exact figure even matter? It opened at London's Strand Theatre on June 3rd, 1993. Over 100 now-ruined dignitaries flew out for opening night. A crowd of angry citizens back home reportedly tried to physically stop the delegation's plane from leaving, clinging to it on the tarmac as it taxied for takeoff. The show ran for 37 performances, closed July 10th. Reviews were savage. One critic apparently couldn't get past a scene where Leonardo slaps the Mona Lisa on the backside, mid-song. It flopped completely, and the money went with it. Meanwhile, Air Nauru, the national airline for a country of 10,000 people, was at one point flying a fleet of 5 Boeing 737s. Former presidents reportedly commandeered the planes for personal holidays, occasionally stranding paying passengers on the tarmac while they did. That fleet eventually shrank to one aircraft.
By the 1990s, the fund that was supposed to bankroll the country forever had been gutted by fraud, vanity projects, and plain bad judgment. One estimate suggests that if it had simply matched the returns of a well-run fund like Norway's, Nauruan families today would be sitting on something close to $4 million each. Instead, by the early 2000s, the fund was, in the words of one of its own former managers, who quit after 2 months on the job, on the brink of total insolvency.
Here's the cruel twist, though. Even if the money had been managed perfectly, Nauru still had a second problem: the island itself. Roughly 80% of Nauru's interior, the entire high plateau, topside, the exact ground I opened this video standing on, had been stripped bare by decades of open mining. Bulldozers scraped off the topsoil, then the phosphate underneath, and left behind exactly what I described: jagged limestone pinnacles, some over head height, nothing growing between them, no soil left to grow anything in. By the early 2000s, the easily reachable reserves were basically exhausted, and most of the population had been squeezed onto a narrow ring of livable coastline, circling an uninhabitable core. Nauru actually sued Australia over this in 1989 at the International Court of Justice for damage done during the mining years before independence. The case finally settled out of court in 1993, the same year as the musical. Make of that timing what you will. So picture the combination: the trust fund empty, the land wrecked, a population of roughly 10 to 12,000 people, with almost no path back to the life they'd had a generation earlier. Unsurprisingly, Nauru got desperate. Through the late 1990s, it leaned into offshore banking, with next to no oversight. Hundreds of shell banks registered to a single building, and started selling passports to anyone willing to pay. International watchdogs eventually blacklisted the country as a hub for money laundering. Nauru dropped both strategies under pressure, but the reputational damage stuck, and the bills still needed paying. Which brings us to 2001, and a ship called the Tampa. That August, a Norwegian cargo vessel rescued more than 400 asylum seekers from a sinking boat off Australia's coast. Australia refused to let them land. Instead, under a new policy that came to be called the Pacific Solution, they were sent to Nauru, and Nauru, in exchange for hosting them, got paid. The arrangement has opened and closed a few times since. Shut down in 2008, reopened in 2012 after boat arrivals spiked again, closed, reopened once more. But some version of it has stuck around for over 2 decades now. By 2021 and 2022, roughly 2/3 of the entire Nauruan government's revenue was tied directly to hosting this one facility. A country that once made its fortune pulling fertilizer out of the ground now makes a large share of it holding other countries' unwanted paperwork, 3,000 miles from where any of it started. There's a smaller, quieter income stream. 2. Fishing rights. Nauru's exclusive economic zone, the stretch of ocean it legally controls, is enormous compared to the island itself, and it sits in some of the best skipjack tuna waters on the planet. Selling licenses to foreign fishing fleets brings in millions a year, almost passively. And since 2009, a scaled-down mining operation has been digging into secondary phosphate deposits, the stuff too deep or too low grade to have bothered with the first time around, squeezing a modest profit out of rock nobody wanted 40 years ago.
None of this touches the deepest scar, though. That one isn't financial. It's what happened to how Nauruans eat. For most of human history, people on this island lived off fish and whatever grew along that coastal fringe. Then, during the boom years, virtually everything got imported instead. White rice, instant noodles, soda, meat out of a tin. Because why grow food when the government check covered anything you wanted from a shop? Today, close to 95% of Nauruans are classified as overweight or obese. More than 4 in 10 people here live with type 2 diabetes, the highest rate recorded anywhere on Earth. Limb amputations from the disease are common enough that almost every family on the island has been touched by one. All of this just keeps crumbling. Below stars, then a warning label for the future. And if you like this stuff, please subscribe and comment. I'd love to hear what you think.
Nauru today is home to somewhere around 12,000 people. Tourism is close to non-existent. The country grants only a small trickle of visitor permits each year. Nearly everything still arrives by cargo ship on a weekly schedule, which is why someone who visited recently reported paying something like $20 for a single mango. A frozen pie, by comparison, ran about 12. Cheaper to eat what comes frozen off a container ship than what could, in theory, grow 6 feet away.
So here's where that leaves us. A nation that got fabulously wealthy almost by accident, off literal bird droppings, compressed over millions of years into rock, burned through both the money and the land inside a single human lifetime, and now survives largely by renting out its coastline to hold problems that belong to somebody else. It's not a morality play with a clean villain. It's closer to a warning label. And there are other small, resource-rich nations right now, watching lithium or rare earths pour out of their own ground, who'd do well to actually read it.
If this is the kind of story that gets under your skin the way it got under mine, subscribe to Geography Uncovered. We cover places exactly like this every week. The corners of the map that never make the front page, but absolutely should. Tell me down in the comments which vanished empire, boom and bust story you want covered next. I'll see you in the next one.